Continuing now with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days, which as claims in big headline on the back, the biggest story. Only the Pulitzer Prize winning team of Woodward and Bernstein could have written this shattering portrait of the presidency in crisis. Has blurbs here from various leading newspapers. New York Times says Mr. Nixon emerges as a tragic figure weathering a catastrophic ordeal and weathering it with considerable courage and dignity. Chicago Sun-Times, absolutely mesmerizing. And the Los Angeles Times, fascinating, macabre, mordant, melancholy, frightening. Selected by Book of the Month Club, Playboy Book Club, and Fortune Book Club. So now we continue. We left off in our last session, at the end of last session, in the middle of chapter 12. Actually, about 2/3 of the way through chapter 12, I guess. And we just had read about President and Mrs. Nixon and David and Julie Eisenhower returning from a nighttime cruise on the Sequoia. Nixon had gotten angry, called his press secretary Ron Ziegler and complained about the press hounding him because he heard that press was waiting at the dock to try to get pictures of his face to show his mood. But as turned out, they docked. They hurried him to the limo, and before the press could get a picture of him. The days of May 1974 were lonely ones for Mrs. Nixon. There was an occasional reception or a tea, Military Wives of the Year, the Women's National Republican Club, a tea for visiting high school students from Ohio, the Senate Wives Luncheon, a breakfast for the wives of former members of Congress, saying hello to the veteran of foreign wars, Poppy Girl. Almost invariably, Mrs. Nixon's appearances were short. She would arrive, shake a few hands, smile, allow a few photographs, and leave. The few times she lingered were when small children visited the White House. Then she would become animated, a joy in her face evident. Members of her staff marveled at how children always seemed to seek her out, even in a crowded room. Most of the First Lady's days were spent in her pale yellow bedroom on the second floor of the mansion. Her room and the blue sitting room adjoining it overlooked the south grounds and offered a spectacular view of the Jefferson Memorial and beyond. A devoted letter writer, she spent hours on her correspondence, and she did a lot of reading, including the thin, inspirational volumes on friendship and love, which rested on the night table next to her canopied bed. These were her rooms, and she had her privacy. Around 11 a.m., she would write out her lunch order, most often a chef's salad, soup or a sandwich, and coffee to be served at 1 o'clock. More often than not these days, the tray came back to the kitchen with the coffee gone and the food untouched. When she and the president dined alone, there was always a great rush to get the food from the kitchen to the table. Often the Nixons had been seated for only a minute before the butlers started pressing to serve them. Why the big rush? A member of the kitchen staff had asked. A minute is a long time when you're not talking, a butler had explained. On Camp David weekends, the president and his wife hardly saw each other. When they did, silence usually prevailed. Backstairs, their distance was an open secret. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Jack Brennan, the president's military aide, joked that his duties included briefing Nixon on how to kiss his wife. Mrs. Nixon had always hated being a political wife. Since Nixon had come to Washington as a congressman, she yearned to return permanently with her husband and children to California and live like an ordinary American family. She and her husband had not really been close since the early 1960s, the First Lady confided to one of her White House physicians. She had wanted to divorce him after his 1962 defeat in the California gubernatorial campaign. She tried and failed to win his promise not to seek office again. Her rejection of his advances since then had seemed to shut something off inside Nixon, but they had stuck it out. Watergate, and the tapes particularly, widened the gap. Despite the rein she kept on her emotions, the transcripts had visibly disturbed her. How foolish to have tapes, she told her few friends and several chosen assistants. She would then smile or laugh nervously. The tapes were like love letters, she said. They should have been burned or destroyed. The White House physicians were worried about the First Lady. She had returned from a South American trip in April 1974, distraught and even more underweight than usual. She was becoming more and more reclusive and drinking heavily. On several occasions, members of the household staff came upon her in the pantry of the second-floor kitchen, where the liquor was kept, in the early afternoon. Awkwardly, she had tried to hide her tumbler of bourbon on the rocks. Helen Smith, Mrs. Nixon's press secretary, tried to get the First Lady out to more parties and receptions, but whenever there was a gathering, there were reporters with Watergate questions. "Why bring it up?" Mrs. Nixon asked dejectedly when reporters caught up with her on a trip or on one of the family's dinner outings in Washington restaurants. Smith had a tough job. Delicate and generous by nature, she had felt cruelly pushed around by Haldeman. Now Ziegler commanded her like a drill sergeant, oblivious to either her wishes or the First Lady's. He ignored Smith's memos and almost never asked her opinion on Mrs. Nixon's public appearances. The president himself insisted on picking the menus and the guest lists and on supervising the seating arrangements for state dinners at the White House. Ziegler and the president also concerned themselves with the slightest details of Mrs. Nixon's few public appearances. Mrs. Nixon's attitude toward such events was principally one of resistance. When Smith tried to schedule interviews or television appearances, the First Lady usually refused, saying, "Dick's too busy." Tricia Nixon Cox, called Dolly by her mother, also hated public appearances and avoided interviews scrupulously. So Julie Nixon Eisenhower, the younger daughter, became the family link to the outside world. In the days following release of the transcripts, Helen Smith was bombarded with requests for interviews with someone in the family. Julie and David agreed to meet reporters on Saturday, May 11th. It was a big event. Julie, wearing a polka dot blouse, and David, in a Lacoste tennis shirt, stood before separate microphones in the East Garden. The noonday sun was brilliant. Question: do either of you foresee any point at which the president would resign? Absolutely not. No, David replied. He is stronger now than he ever has been in his determination to see this through, Julie added. The next question came from Robert Pierpont of CBS. Robert Pierpont of CBS. Mrs. Eisenhower, may I say first of all that I feel I have to apologize for addressing these questions to you, since in our system we do not hold the sins of the fathers against the following generations, and we don't have a monarchy in which you are going to inherit the power. I am not quite sure why you are here to answer these questions. Julie was visibly agitated. Mr. Pierpont, I am going to try to control myself in answering the question because it really does wound me. I have seen what my father has gone through, and I am so proud of him that I would never be afraid to come out here and talk to any members of the press about resignation or anything else, even though it goes against my grain, because I know he does not want me out here, because he does not want anyone to construe that I am trying to answer questions for him. Her voice was quivering. I am not trying to answer questions for him. I am just trying to pray for enough courage to meet his courage, really. Another questioner asked Julie how her mother was bearing up. She is able to take things with a grain of salt, Julie replied. She is philosophical, and I guess she finds she can hold up under all of this because she loves my father and believes in him. As the interview neared its end, the president's daughter observed, he is not shackled by Watergate. If you look at his appointment schedule, if you see the things he is doing, the people he is meeting with, it all confirms the message. The White House switchboard was flooded with calls praising Julie's performance. Later that afternoon, Smith encountered the president going up in the elevator and mentioned the response. He just stood there silently. He does not look well, Smith thought. He does not look strong or vigorous. Nixon's face looked damp from sweat. She thought, this man is not in control of the situation. As she turned away, she saw tears in his eyes. Few of the president's men were as shocked by the transcripts as the senior academic intellectual members of the Nixon administration. Arthur F. Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, ambassador to India and formerly an advisor on domestic policy. George P. Schultz, formerly the president's economic counselor. They read the transcripts in different parts of the world. They heard a Richard Nixon they had never been exposed to. Whatever Nixon's failings, these men had often been impressed by the president's strength, his competence, and the keenness of his mind. The Nixon of the transcripts was weak, insecure, indecisive, inarticulate, uncomprehending, even incompetent at times. The conspiratorial nature of the discussion surprised them less. In their minds, Watergate had always seemed characteristic of Nixonian excess. They knew the president could be petty, vicious, vindictive, unprincipled, particularly when he was with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Heretofore, they could only guess at the hidden side of his personality. Now, as they read the thick blue volume with its deleted expletives and coarse, cynical language, Candy asked, the hangout route. The guesswork was ended. There were basic elements of that Nixon character which the president could not bring himself to show them, they concluded. They were men he regarded as lofty thinkers, whose respect and approval he coveted and courted. Burns, the president's chief domestic aide and counselor during the first 2 years of his administration, was especially shocked. Nixon had spoken clearly, decisively, grammatically, and even eloquently to him. He had rarely sworn behind a mild goddamn. The transcripts were full of presidential grunts, unfinished sentences, meandering thoughts which began almost nowhere and finished someplace else. Burns had never heard some of the expressions. He thought, here's a Dr. Jekyll, a split personality. What does it all mean? Does Nixon live a double life? Is he a great actor? Henry Kissinger was less amazed. He was in the Middle East when the transcripts were revealed. Copies of the blue books were forwarded to the secretary's plane. At night, in his hotel and shuttling by air between capitals, he had time to read. He put aside the material that had been packed for him, a book on chess, some thrillers, and a pornographic novel, and turned to the transcripts with morbid fascination. Around Kissinger, Nixon was proud, even arrogant. Here the president seemed full of self-loathing, oblivious to bullying and disrespect from his subordinates. Ehrlichman talked to the president like an exasperated parent addressing a stupid child. The language was baffling. Sure, the president occasionally referred to someone as an asshole after a few drinks, but never much more than that. In Kissinger's presence, Nixon was almost prudish, prissy even, the secretary thought. Nixon's greatest personal asset, Kissinger had thought, was his willingness to make big decisions himself. Seeking consultation with only a few people, an ability to, quote, take big bites of a problem, as the secretary phrased it. But here, with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, the fanatics, it was all different. Watching the conspiracy unfold in the taped conversations confirmed what Kissinger had suspected. Of course, that's how it must have happened and evolved, he told his aides. This explains why Nixon refused to cut his ties with Haldeman and Ehrlichman even after their resignations, end quote. The transcripts would be Nixon's undoing. Even if he clung to office, how would he govern after this? All moral authority was gone, Kissinger said. The deletions and denigrating characterizations suggested something else, long concealed, about the Nixon character. Rumors and some reliable reports were circulated that Nixon regularly employed ethnic slurs, particularly anti-Semitic ones, and that some had been deleted from the transcripts. Was Nixon a racist? An anti-Semite? For his part, Kissinger was convinced that the president was anti-Semitic. He had believed it for years. As the son of German Jews who had fled the Nazis, he was particularly sensitive to what he regarded in Nixon as a dangerous brand of anti-Jewish prejudice born of ignorance. He saw in the president an antagonistic gut reaction which stereotyped Jews and convinced Nixon that they were his enemies. Many times Kissinger returned from a meeting with Nixon and told his deputy, Lawrence Eagleburger, that man is an anti-Semite. The remark by Nixon, which most often unsettled Kissinger, was well known to the president's close associates. Quote, the Jewish cabal is out to get me. End quote. The meaning of the often repeated comment was a source of debate within the administration. Many believed that it reflected hostility more to intellectuals than to Jews. Late in 1971, Nixon had summoned the White House personnel chief, Fred Malek, to his office to discuss a, quote, Jewish cabal in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The cabal, Nixon said, was tilting economic figures to make his administration look bad. How many Jews were there in the Bureau? He wanted to know. Malek reported back on the number and told the president that the Bureau's methods of weighing statistics were normal procedure that had been in use for years. Later, there was another suspected, quote, Jewish cabal in another department. Malek, a young West Point and Harvard Business School graduate who had been brought into the administration by Haldeman, knew that these tirades were not reserved for Jews. The president had once told him he did not want any more, quote, fucking academics or, quote, goddamn Ivy Leaguers appointed to high positions. They were wrecking his programs. Most, if not all, of the problems in government could be traced to them. Haldeman had directed Malek to ignore presidential orders which suggested departmental purges or quotas, and Nixon did in fact continue to approve appointments of academics, even Ivy League ones, and Jews. Arthur Burns, himself a Jew, was convinced that Nixon was not truly anti-Semitic. There were, however, ugly strands of prejudice in the man, Burns had concluded, and he was not surprised that there were apparently anti-Semitic remarks on the tapes. The president really didn't have much love for humanity, Burns believed. Why should Nixon love Jews any more than Japanese or Italians or Catholics? Nixon regularly employed epithets for whole sections of mankind, he knew. Burns and Kissinger had often discussed the question. Burns used to point out that the president greatly admired Israel and that a large number of Jews served in the administration. What disturbed Burns was something he considered apart from anti-Semitism. If the president perceived that Jews or Israel or anyone else for that matter got in his way, he was prepared to stomp them. Burns vividly recalled a 1973 White House meeting during which the president had a tantrum about an amendment to his trade bill. The amendment would have restricted business with the Soviet Union if Russia did not ease its persecutions of Jews. Members of the Jewish community were causing him difficulties, Nixon had said, because of their support for the amendment. A wave of anti-Semitism might descend on American Jews if they persisted, he predicted. Burns watched Nixon very closely on that occasion, and he was impressed by the president's fury. Burns felt that Nixon was saying that Jews might suffer for thwarting his will. After a year of dealing with Nixon, Fred Bazart had learned to discount the president's diatribes. Nixon said vile things about everybody, about bureaucrats, congressmen, reporters, lawyers, Russians, Democrats, Easterners, ethnic groups, his own staff. Just after David and Julie's press conference that Saturday, Fred Graham, a CBS television reporter, called the White House press office for comment on a story scheduled for that evening's news. Graham had information that in 2 of the tapes the president had made disparaging remarks about Jews and had called Judge Sirica a wop. When he was asked by Ziegler, Bazart insisted to the press secretary that he had heard no such thing on the tapes. Ziegler tried but couldn't talk Graham out of the story, so he moved to kill it. He told 2 of his secretaries to get hold of CBS correspondent Dan Rather. Failing that, they were to reach Walter Cronkite or the CBS Washington bureau chief, or the producer of the CBS Evening News, or the president of CBS, Arthur Taylor. None could be reached. Ziegler blamed the secretaries and started shouting at them when the story went on the air. "Ron, we can only place the calls," responded Ann Greer. "If you think you can do any better, then be my guest." The next morning, a similar story by Seymour M. Hersh ran in the Sunday New York Times. Hersh cited conversations between Nixon and Dean on February 28th and March 20th, 1973. Both the White House and James Doyle, chief press officer for Special Prosecutor Jaworski, had tried to call Hersh off the story. Doyle had checked transcripts of the 2 conversations Hersh referred to, and he couldn't find the references. The problem, it was later discovered in the White House, had been caused by transcription errors. One of the original transcripts ascribed the phrase Jewish boys to the president. A corrected version put it in Dean's mouth. And an initial and therefore uncorrected version of the other transcript in question indeed had the president calling Judge Sirica a goddamn wop, but Nixon's actual words, which sounded similar on the scratchy recording, had been, "That's the kind I want," a reference to tough judges like Sirica. There were ethnic references on the same tapes, including some that might be regarded as anti-Semitic, but Bazart knew they were not the remarks cited in Hersh's account. The president had, in fact, said on one tape that it was not going to be his policy to have a Jewish seat on the Supreme Court, as it had been for some other presidents. Jews, he said, were intelligent and aggressive and were everywhere in the government. If any minority group needed a leg up, it clearly was not the Jews. Nixon had then praised his liberal foe on the court, Justice William O. Douglas, and had made disparaging comments about his own appointees. Now Haig, Ziegler, and Bazart felt they finally had an opportunity to strike back at the opposition. The president had been unfairly accused. On Sunday morning, Bazart appeared on an interview show to denounce the news accounts. "There have been fabrications," he said. "There have been attempts to portray remarks that are on the tapes as racial slurs, and they are not. And I wonder, it's clear that a concerted campaign has been made to cause these to be publicized." He clasped his fingers together to denote the interlocking nature of the conspiracy. And that is one of the problems. It bothers many of us. Obviously, this type of material is not relevant to the question of whether the president has committed treason, bribery, or high crimes or misdemeanors. I can only characterize this as malicious and vicious attempts to poison the public mind against the president by any means. On Monday morning at the Birch Group meeting, Bazard argued forcefully for some countermove to the stories. Garment, a Jew, agreed to listen to the relevant tapes and then, if justified, to go out on the White House lawn to refute the Times and CBS accounts in front of cameras. At 10 o'clock one evening that week, Garment got a call at home from Julie. "Daddy wants to see you." Garment drove back to the White House and went to the Lincoln sitting room. Julie got beers for the men and left. He was upset about the stories the president told Garment. He wasn't what they were saying he was. Garment replied that he didn't need convincing. It was absurd to call Nixon an anti-Semite. Look at all the Jews he had appointed to high posts. "The stories are very unfair," the president concurred, "and they should correct them." "That would not be simple," Garment explained. "The only way would be to make the relevant portions public. Would the president allow him to do that?" "He would." They had another beer and talked for an hour about the distinctions between what people, even presidents, say and what they actually mean. In anger or frustration, things are said that are not meant. The taping system had etched inconsequential presidential remarks in stone. The next day, Garment called Clifton Daniel, the New York Times Washington bureau chief, and offered to let him listen to the relevant portions of the tapes. Daniel said that he would agree if he were allowed to listen to the full conversation. Garment realized that Daniel was making him an offer that the White House could not but refuse. Garment had listened to the, I didn't say could not refuse, could not but refuse. Garment had listened to the two tapes, and he certainly could not recommend that anyone, especially the New York Times, be allowed to hear them. There were things that would prove highly embarrassing to the president, and Garment never appeared on the White House lawn to refute the stories. Later, Ziegler informed the president that he was certain that a member of the White House staff had helped the Times and CBS develop the accounts. Ziegler thought he knew who had done it. "I want him fired in 5 minutes," the president shouted into the phone. "I want a progress report in 3 minutes." Ziegler tried to reach the suspect. 2 or 3 minutes later, the president was back on the phone. Where was the progress report? Ziegler said he was trying to locate the culprit. The president hung up. He was soon served his dinner, and the matter was dropped. Ziegler told him later that he wasn't sure any longer that he had, in fact, found the right person. No one was fired. On Monday afternoon, May 13th, the president gave a 90-minute interview to Rabbi Korf for a book that was to be published by the clergyman's anti-impeachment crusade. Nixon leaned back in his chair. The sun refracted through the 3-inch thick bulletproof windows behind him, the beams of light bouncing off his highly polished desk. "How do you stand up under this kind of vilification and attack and savagery that has gone on for the past year and a half?" Korf asked. "What enables you to persevere?" "Part of it is inheritance," the president said. "A strong mother, strong father, both of whom worked hard and were incidentally deeply religious. And a very strong family, my wife and my 2 daughters, and my 2 sons-in-law, all of whom stand like a rock against the attacks. But in more personal terms, it gets down to what the Quakers call peace at the center. The individual cannot succumb to the attack or take the easy way out like resigning the office, as I could have on other occasions, by not running for the office in the first instance, taking the easy way out after a defeat, or thinking, well, I'll go out and make money, which is very easy for me being a fairly accomplished lawyer. I don't change at the center. I don't go overboard when we win, and I don't get terribly depressed when we lose. I don't go overboard when things are good. I don't go overboard when they are bad. And it is keeping on an even keel. The Midwesterners had a term. They say, stay steady in the buggy. But the most important factor is that the individual must know inside, deep inside, that he is right. As people look back on the years of the 70s, Watergate will be written about as being something very difficult to understand, particularly coming in the campaign of an individual who's supposed to be a political pro, which I am. I believe that when it is all sorted out in the end, it will be found that there has been harassment on a massive basis of innocent people, that many without guilt have had their reputations badly damaged, and I fear, too, that it will be found that many who have been charged with guilt have been charged on flimsy indictments. I am not the press's favorite pinup boy, Nixon told the rabbi. If it hadn't been Watergate, there would probably have been something else. So now they have this, but I will survive it. And I just hope they will survive it with, shall we say, as much serenity as I have. And thus ends chapter 12 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. So in the next session, we'll begin chapter 13. Thanks for watching.